Assalamu alaikum. So far in this discussion series, we've talked about Surah Wal-Asr, and we've used that as the backbone of all of our discussions. This really short surah in the Quran has already taught us so much. And let's just recap then. So, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان في خسر إلا الذين آمنوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. And we talked about 4 conditions, I think, over the last few days of fulfilling the struggle. So the first condition was realizing the truth. The second condition was doing something with that truth. The third condition, what was the third condition? To do good deeds. Yeah, so do amal salihat. And the fourth condition was to be patient, so to be in a state of sabr. And yesterday we talked about sabr in particular, and we talked about how important it was to be patient when we're given afflictions, hardships, death, illness, disease. We know that every one of us is going to be affected with hardship at some point in our lives. Yesterday we spoke about what it means to be patient. We looked at the world and we reflected on how the world makes it a bit more difficult for us to be in a state of patience. We thought about how we need to safeguard ourselves from the world so that we're able to build in a state of sabr. But then we added another depth. And we thought, when there's so much hardship around us, when there's so much struggle, when there's so much difficulty, when there's so much disease, when there's so much death, when there's so much war, when there's so much famine, when there's so much financial hardship, how can it be possible to be patient? So just put that question on the side. How is it possible to be patient? And indirectly, every time we've discussed over the last few nights, we've talked about death. So we talked about Nazanko and his last few words written in the Azad, by the way. We talked about the 39-year-old who had end-stage kidney disease waiting a transplant. Yesterday I talked about the mother who'd lost a son at the age of 3. Then we talked about the care home patient who was dying of cancer. And then we revisited faith and thought, well, if you didn't believe in Allah and you didn't believe in the unseen and the akhirah, how difficult would your journey in patience be? You could still be patient, but it would be really difficult, right? Because if, God forbid, one of your family members dies, or those of you who have lost family members, if you think you're never going to meet them again, and there was no chance of being brought up again, how could it be? How easy would it be to be patient? So today I wish to tell you a story which is derived from the Quran. And that story sometimes helps us to understand that there is always a greater wisdom at play. That sometimes things happen in life that seem bad, but there is always a wisdom over it. And if we zoom out, it actually looks better than what it seems. I'm hoping that this story will help us to understand patience. And with the knowledge of that greater wisdom, it might help us to understand some of the events that go on in our world. So this particular story is from Surah Al-Kahf, so chapter of the cave, and it's about Musa alayhi salam, Moses, and Khidr alayhi salam. So Musa was speaking to a group of people because he was a messenger, and a person had asked him, "O Musa, who is the most knowledgeable person on earth? Who is the greatest person of knowledge?" Musa said, "I am the greatest person of knowledge." So Musa assumed he was the most knowledgeable. And if you look at Musa alayhi salam had a reason to assume that because Allah had talked to him directly on the mountain. He led one of the greatest communities ever on earth. So in terms of the number of followers, he had loads of followers. he was one of the greatest prophets to have ever lived. And so at that time, if Musa was asked who was the most knowledgeable, it was okay, I suppose, for him to say, well, I am the most knowledgeable. But then as soon as Musa said this, Allah has sent down angel Jibril. And Jibril said to Musa, "O Musa, how can you speak without any knowledge? How could you say something that you didn't actually know? You just made an assumption. You can't just speak about religion like this. You can't just speak about the unseen like this. Verily, we have somebody on earth who has knowledge that you don't have. Then how can you make this claim that you are the most knowledgeable?" Are you all following? So immediately Musa alayhi salam humbled himself and said, "O Allah, give me permission to meet this person who has more knowledge than me. Let me go and study with him." So already we can learn something from Musa. In that moment, automatically he was humble. It shows that he had humility. He had no qualms in lowering himself for the sake of knowledge. So eventually Musa meets this mystical character called Khidr. He's a person. And he asks Khidr and tells him that, "Let me follow you so I can gain some of your knowledge." So Musa asks Khidr, "Let me follow you and join you on your journey so I can learn some stuff from you." Khidr replies that, "O Musa, you won't have enough patience to be with me." So just to recap, so Khidr is telling a messenger of God that you won't have enough patience to be with me. Musa alayhi salam says, "Give me a try. Trust me, I'll listen to you. I want to learn what I do not know." Khidr says to him, "You can join me on this journey, but there is only one condition. Don't ask me what I am doing until I tell you. Don't interfere. This isn't your job. I have a mission and I'm going to go and do whatever it is I have to do. So please don't ask me until I have told you and explained things as to what I'm doing." So Musa says, "Okay, we'll do it, no problem." So this is the first part of the story. There's 3 parts, okay? So then they go off on their journey and they come to a river. And in this river, at the bank, they see a fishing boat and they want to cross this river, but they've got no means of crossing. They didn't have any money. The fishing ship, rather, I think it's better to describe as a ship, belonged to some fishermen. They wanted to get across and get to the other side. And so they said to the fishermen, "We don't have any money, but if you're going to the other side, can you please take us?" So the fishermen agreed to take them to the other side of the river. So just as they were about to get to the end, the Musa and Khidr started to do something, and the fishermen were casting the net, so they're distracted. So Khidr comes to the hull of the boat, pulls out this massive axe, and just breaks a hole in the bottom of the boat. So water starts coming in. But fortunately, they can make a bit of an escape because it's nearly to the shore. And so Musa and Khidr went on their way. And so hold on, they've just been given a free ride and they've returned their generosity by drilling a hole in the boat. So Musa obviously is a messenger of God. He's not going to take that. He's going to, he looks at injustice and needs to speak out. So he saw injustice and he says, "How could you have done this to these people when they are so generous? They gave us a free lift. They didn't need to give us a free lift. Why did you do this to them?" And then Khidr replies to him and he says, "I told you that you wouldn't have any patience with me. That you do not know what I know." So Musa says, "That's true, you did tell me. I forgot. I genuinely forgot, it's a mistake. Don't give me a tough time because of it." So barely as he finished the sentence, the second part of the story starts. And this is a bit more difficult to digest. And even though the axe is still fresh to the wounds of the hull of the ship, Gidr meets a group of kids and they're just playing. And he literally takes one kid and eliminates him. Like, end of. This kid dies. And Musa hasn't forgotten the condition that he's just promised with Gidr. And he said, the taking of a life is a really big thing, especially the life of a young child. But he couldn't keep himself suppressed. He said, why have you done that? Why have you taken an innocent life? He was in a bit of a rage. He was struggling to be patient at that point. And Gidr said to him, did I not tell you that you wouldn't have enough patience in the things that I do? I know what you do not. Musa didn't forget and didn't have an excuse. He said, you know what, you're right, but let me have one more chance. Basically, if I ever interrupt you again, then we can part ways. 3 strikes and I'm out. So the story moves on to a third part, and by this point they've not eaten, they've not drank, and they're both really hungry. And they get to a small town. And normally it's hospitable to give strangers or guests a little bit of hospitality, so some water, some bread, some shelter. It's within our if somebody comes to the hall and they're guests and they're travelling, we'd ask them to join us to eat, right? And perhaps give them some shelter. But this particular town didn't give them anything. In fact, they hurled abuse at them and pelted them. So Gidr looks at this wall and it's crumbling. This wall is literally crumbling. And he tells Musa, I'm going to go and rebuild this wall for them. And he goes on to rebuild this wall. So Musa again didn't forget. He knows full well that he shouldn't question the actions of Gidr. He said, okay, we've rebuilt this wall, at least I should get something for it, some water, some food, because they didn't get anything for it afterwards. So Gidr said to Moses, so that's it, that's strike 3. You said, Musa said, that if I interrupt you again, then we should part ways. And so they were going to go back to their separate ways. Then Gidr said, now I'm going to tell you that you had no patience, tell you of what you had no patience to understand. And in this story, in this lesson, I think there's relevance to all of us here, that the same trials affect all of us. And we need to try and understand some of the trials that Allah had sent down in this particular story. So the first trial for the boat, so that's number 1. Gidr said that it belonged to a group of poor people who were fishermen. They were poor people. But at the time, there was this king who was seizing everybody's boats. So the king and his men used to go around, were going to go around in that area and seize all the boats for their army. And by putting a hole in the hull of the boat, they would have seen that the boat is damaged, and they wouldn't have taken it. Had he not put the hole in the ship, the king's men would have taken the boat away. And for these poor people, that was their entire existence. Their livelihood was based on this boat. And so, through the generosity of the people of the boat, if you think about it, Allah preserved their vehicle of generosity. So let me just say that again. So the people who showed their generosity on the boat, Allah preserved their vehicle of generosity. So they showed their generosity through the boat, but Allah saved the boat to give them even more in terms of blessings. So what we're generous with, Allah will be even more generous to us. And if we want barakat and blessings in our own money, we need to put our barakat and time in our lives for the things that Allah will be pleased with. Now, going back to when Musa and Khidr put the hole in the ship, can you imagine if the fishermen actually realised that it was these guys who drilled the hole in the boat? They're going to be, raging. I would be, So if you give someone a free lift and they damage your car, you'd be raging, right? But then, as soon as they will have seen the king and the men confiscating all the boats, that rage will have turned into actual gratitude. So it's funny how in just a moment, a man can just change his perception of what's going on in life. So if you think about it, this smaller musibat is saving them from a larger musibat, right? Musibat, trial, difficulty. So this small difficulty has saved them from a larger difficulty. So they know that if they put their trust in Allah, and that you put your trust and patience in Allah, then perhaps we can also save ourselves from these trials. So next time we're in a financial loss, next time we're in an accident or in a tragic situation, I think we ought to remember the story of the fisherman. Put your trust in Allah. If you're truly generous and you're a good person, Allah will use these smaller trials to protect you against a bigger one. So how do you explain the death of a child, though? I mean, that's big, isn't it? So every parent that's here, they'll know that the most traumatic thing that could ever happen to them is losing a child. And you'd probably put your life on the line 1,000 times before you'd allow your child to die. This is in a manner by which us humans are created to protect our children. Can you imagine the pain and suffering the parents of that particular child will have felt? But Khidr explains to Musa that these parents of that particular child were righteous parents. They believed in Allah. And Allah knew that this child, when this child would grow up, would be ungrateful, arrogant, abusive, oppressive. He'd mock his parents and the society around him. He'd belittle them when they were older. And Khidr basically, in essence, said to Musa that if you've got a child who is so oppressive to the world, it's better not to have that child than to have it. And that is why he took the child out. I mean, this is a messenger. The levels of wisdom that they have is greater than the perception that we can have of the story, because even that sounds pretty intense. But realize that Allah doesn't ever take a blessing away without giving another one. Often it's a bigger blessing than what was taken. So in this particular family, Allah gave them a righteous child who then actually looked after his or her parents. And another thing to remember is that Allah actually, the love Allah has for us is greater than that our own mother has for us. And that's a really powerful way of putting things. The final incident is the wall. So this particular wall belonged to two small children who lost their father. And their father had actually buried their inheritance beneath that wall. Had that wall crumbled, then the evil people of the town would have taken the rights of inheritance away from their children, and they would have taken it. So sometimes Allah knows best when it's time to give us what we need. So you never know, at that time that children and the mother were perhaps praying for that wealth. But that wealth was received by them perhaps 15, 20 years later. So we could pray for one thing today, but we should be aware that Allah is listening to our prayers and it could manifest itself 15, 20, 30 years later. The fundamental point in these stories is that when we have a good relationship with Allah, our problems and musibats are actually blessings in disguise. If we hold on to the fact that the believer is never punished for the sake of pure punishment, and if we ever hold on to the fact that whatever happens to somebody who believes in God is for the benefit of the believer, then perhaps we can be more patient in our trials and tribulations. Be it in the car when someone's going at, 25 in a 40 zone, or whether someone's afflicted with trials and hardships. So, if you think about it, these stories give us an insight into the spiritual, unseen world. The Quran calls it al-Ghaib, the unseen. It shows that Allah is executing justice in the world in ways that we cannot understand. Yeah, the ship got damaged, but there's a bigger thing at play. Yes, a child died, a terrible thing, but there is a bigger wisdom at play. Yes, they mended the wall in a town which didn't respect them, but there's a bigger wisdom at play. So let's just try and link this back to Karbala if we can, just for a moment. Do you think Imam Hussein knew of the tragedy to befall his family? He did. He took his entire family to the plains of Karbala. The knowledge of Karbala was within him before he embarked on this journey. He knew that Allah had a higher plan and a higher wisdom behind what was to happen that day. if you remember when Mullah recites the Shahadat al-Bayan, when Imam Hussein is in sajda before he dies, before he's killed, Jibreel appears to him and he asks, if it is your will, we can destroy this entire enemy army for you. But Imam Hussein alayhi salam replies and asks, what is Allah's decree in this? And Allah's decree was that Imam Hussein returned to Allah in that moment. So we're reaping the blessings of that perhaps today. Imam Hussein and Ahlul Bayt have given us a vehicle so strong to remember his sacrifice that it allows us to bind our faith to Allah through this struggle. So that's the end of the discussion today. And I've not prepared anything for tomorrow yet, so I was just thinking about what to prepare in the car on the way here. And I was like thinking, okay, so we've talked about the unseen reality of the world from the outside. But what about the unseen reality from us within? So we are men, we can see, we can hear, we can feel, we can touch. We've got brains, we've got a mind which thinks. But what is that? You know, we talk about the ruh within the human being, the soul. What could the journey of the soul actually be? And perhaps we need to understand that to really maybe, be able to understand and act patience properly. There's two things I just want to leave you with. So the first thing is that when a child is born, what's the first thing the father does? Gives the azan, right? And somebody once said to me that you give the azan at birth, and let's just go back to janazah namaz. Do we give azan then? So we don't give azan during janazah namaz, and there's a thought that the azan that we give at birth is the azan for your janazah prayer. So that's the first thing that I just want you to reflect on, which is quite powerful. The second thing, this is a bit out there, but just think of the most dictatorial person in the world right now. Trump. So Moshe Uncle says Donald Trump. So if I said to you that the Islamic belief is that at one point of his spiritual journey, Donald Trump's soul was a Muslim, what would you say? So that's something that we will reflect on tomorrow, and I'll use the ayahs of the Quran about how Allah actually brought every soul ever created before him, before we were even born. So thanks for listening.